What does it mean to be awake when everything around you seems asleep? How can one maintain lucidity without being swallowed by the collective theater of the social ego? Why does authenticity so often demand solitude? And why does that solitude turn into an accusation from those who do not wish to see? In this video, we will walk through these questions without softeners. We will talk about the invisible pain of consciousness, the illusion of spiritual performance, the paradox of silence, the collective shadow, the hermit's return, the betrayal of one's own conscience, and why disappearing can be a careful, intentional act. I will use Carl Jung as the main lens to interpret these movements of the soul and bring in verses from Rumi as poetic counterpoints, because thought and poetry together describe what reason alone cannot reach. The proposal is twofold: to offer clear naming and, at the same time, invite you into an inner laboratory. Jung reminded us, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." Rumi tenderly added, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." Here, we are not seeking immediate consolation, we are seeking discernment, to identify where your presence is demanded and where it is resisted. Throughout the video, you will encounter psychological arguments, small but ethical practices to protect your integrity, and a proposal for re-entering the world without losing what was cultivated in inner retreat. If you feel the tension between being true and belonging, this is the map to understand why it hurts, and how this pain can become a criterion for evolution, not a sentence of isolation. If awakening is an invitation, it is also a burden. And perhaps the first face of this burden is the invisible pain that accompanies awakened consciousness. Being awake is not always a gentle blessing. It is a weight that settles into the body and nervous system. Those who awaken perceive profound dissonances, moral incoherencies, fragile social narratives, the anesthetized routines of people following scripts. Jung described this movement as the destiny of individuation. Becoming conscious means perceiving what most cannot see, and this generates a form of exhaustion that is not only emotional but somatic. Ethical insomnia, empathy fatigue, hypervigilance toward contradictions. This fatigue arises because the new consciousness constantly collides with the sleeping world. Every social encounter becomes an exercise in containing inner noise. Every news headline, a reminder that few share the same lucidity. There is also a relational cost. You begin to lose the interlocutor who once tolerated your superficiality, and this reduces your sense of belonging. Conscious solitude is born. It is not about isolating out of pride, but about protecting inner integrity. Rumi reminds us that the wound is the passage for light. Here, the wound is consciousness piercing where comfort once was. Practical arguments. The exhaustion of the awakened is a sign of misalignment between inner limits and outer demands. It is distinct from depressive fatigue. It is fatigue from environmental coercion. Thus, the work is not to cure the pain with distractions, but to regulate exposure, cultivating practices that sustain presence, boundaries, periodic silence, small communities that uphold authenticity. In terms of personal development and spiritual awakening, recognizing this pain as the language of the soul allows exhaustion to become a criterion. What preserves my integrity? What can I release without betraying my conscience? And in this attempt to withstand the exhaustion of being awake, we often fall into another trap, turning spirituality into performance. It's as if the ego, weary of resistance, sought a stage to disguise itself. Spiritual performance is a sophisticated defense mechanism. It is not just vanity, but an attempt to domesticate inner chaos with image. Jung called the social mask the persona, the face we present to the world to function. Today, there exists a spiritual persona that appears detached, compassionate, wise, and often hides fear, the need for approval, and disguised narcissism. This spiritualized ego enjoys social benefits and maintains the appearance of inner fulfillment without doing the work of integration. From a psychological standpoint, performance creates a false energy economy. By saving itself from the risk of vulnerability, the person avoids confronting their shadow, and the shadow organizes itself as dissonant behavior, judgment, manipulation, veiled resentment. Rumi warns that the true lover is not measured by appearances. Jung reminds us that individuation demands making the repressed conscious. Thus, authenticity is not born on the stage. It is born in the cave where no audience exists. Retreat is not escape. It is a laboratory. Retreat means withdrawing social projections to observe patterns. Who speaks, who acts, where impulses come from. It is a practical process of dismantling the persona. Writing, asking oneself with clinical rigor, what are my motivations? Allowing emotions without performing them. In terms of personal development and spirituality, retreat provides the space for truth. And truth, once it strikes, dissolves the need to perform. Essential practice. Cultivate small retreats. Half an hour of silence, digital fasting, writing without the intention of sharing, that gradually erode the performative persona and allow the true voice to emerge. But when the masks begin to dissolve, another movement becomes necessary. Silence. Silence not as absence, but as fertile ground where the soul can finally be heard. Silencing oneself may appear antisocial, but silence is an epistemological instrument. It is where one discovers the texture of motivations, patterns, and pains. There is a clear paradox. The more you withdraw from collective noise, the greater your ability to listen, not only to sounds, but to inner contours. Lao Tzu and Eckhart Tolle, in different registers, remind us that presence is born from suspending discursive flow. Jung adds that silence enables active imagination, the inner dialogue that integrates psychic contents. Withdrawing does not mean numbing relationships. It means differentiating external listening from internal listening. The problem today is that mass noise creates a normality that invites complicity and automatized emotional responses. Those who deliberately cultivate silence learn that it is the matrix of creativity and ethics. Without noise, finer choices appear. This distance creates social vulnerability. You may be perceived as cold, aloof, or strange, but it also opens the way for more coherent attitudes. Silence is not moral passivity. On the contrary, it is the refinement of vision before action. True awakening uses silence as a laboratory for effective compassion. To act from presence is more transformative than reacting from amplified noise. Practical applications. Attention routines, brief mindful pauses throughout the day, non-judgmental journaling, and small abstinences from information that will shape a clearer inner field. And as we dive into this silence, we realize something even deeper. We do not carry only our own noise. There is also a collective weight, a shadow that surrounds us and reveals itself precisely when we stop following the crowd. The notion of the collective shadow, an expansion of Jung's personal shadow, describes content repressed by an entire culture. Fears, anxieties, guilt, prejudices. By refusing to participate in mass projections, you become an uncomfortable mirror. People project onto you what they refuse to recognize in themselves. The pain of not belonging, therefore, is often not just about you. It is a symptom of a fragile collective psyche. When we do not fit in, social reaction can vary from indifference to hostility. This generates two traps: internalizing rejection as personal failure, or inflating one's separation into moral pride. Jung calls us not to confuse difference with superiority. Instead, the discomfort offers precious information. Where does my authenticity touch something unintegrated in the other? What collective material am I holding without wanting to? Working with this pain has an initiatory character. Learning to be a safe container for projected content requires maturity, tolerance of solitude, grounding techniques, and the practice of turning it into service. The collective shadow demands integration, not condemnation. There are practical ways: listening without absorbing, setting clear boundaries, finding smaller tribes where honest communication is possible. Rumi offers a reminder: the heart that opens to its own darkness becomes a bridge. Accepting this position is, paradoxically, a higher form of social responsibility. And in this confrontation with the shadow, a new calling emerges, to return to the world, but in another way. The hermit, after silence and integration, must learn to return, and the return carries its own wisdom. After inner work, the challenge of return arises: how to embody learning without being swallowed again by outer demands. Jung spoke of the archetype of the wounded healer, one who brings personal experience to serve, but risks turning pain into a succession of advice or messianism. The wise return is modest. It is bringing oneself whole, not offering solutions. To serve without losing oneself implies 3 practical moves. First, decentralize the self. Act as an instrument, not the center of attention. Second, establish ethical frictions, clear boundaries that protect inner practice. Routine, silence, support community. Third, practice minimizing spectacle. Small, consistent actions surpass grand speeches. Here Rumi's words echo. True work comes from the anonymity of realized love. There is also organizational risk. Social acceptance can pressure the hermit to perform wisdom. Mature resistance means saying no when necessary and accepting relational losses without betraying essence. In terms of personal development and spiritual awakening, return demands constant revalidation through practice, not applause. One serves more when not seeking to be served. One helps more when preserving inner life as a resource. Yet return is not always gentle. Relationships, careers, friendships. The world often demands that we abandon what we have cultivated in silence. And here arises the sharpest pain, the pain of betraying one's own conscience. Betraying one's conscience often occurs in fragments: a word omitted, a conformist choice, a complicit silence. Jung said the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you are. Betrayal severs this bond with destiny. The first practical step is to recognize that betrayal is rarely a single event. It is a pattern, mapping where you yield, in what situations, for which fears, allows for strategic action. There are difficult decisions: remaining in a career that violates principles, sustaining a relationship that demands conformity, staying in a circle that humiliates convictions. The ethical response is not always immediate rupture. Sometimes it is negotiation, reconfiguration of limits, or creating spaces of truth within context. At other times, departure is inevitable. Jung and the wounded healer tradition remind us that moral work costs, but preserves psychic integrity. Concrete practices: list non-negotiables, values that determine choices. Implement small experimental ruptures, like refusing a request that contradicts your ethics, and build a safety net, financial, emotional. Rumi suggests poetic courage. Let fall what pulls you away from the path of the soul. Finally, betrayal transformed into learning can generate a new narrative of meaning. Losses become boundaries that guide rebirth. Thus, we see that each step, the pain, the masks, the silence, the shadow, the return, the betrayal, and even disappearance, are parts of the same journey, the path of awakening that demands maturity and fidelity to one's own soul. Retreat and disappearance are often confused with abandonment. The essential difference is intention and structure. Escapism is reactive evasion. Preparation is purposeful action. The seed in the dark does not flee from life. It prepares the life to come. Jung recognized individuation stages that require withdrawal. Without this time, external changes are superficial and fragile. To architect disappearance is to plan, define an objective. What do I want to refine? Time, resources, and reintegration criteria. This transforms vanishing into an ecological process, financially, intellectually, and emotionally sustainable. It is also an ethical practice, withdrawing not to contaminate, and returning when presence is service, not refuge. Rumi describes the transformations of the lover who leaves and returns transfigured, not fleeing, but perfecting the channel. In practice, create rituals of withdrawal, digital fasting, short retreats, silence exercises. Establish indicators of progress, perceptual shifts, reduced reactivity, and design a re-entry plan. Who will be affected? How to communicate. In this way, disappearance becomes part of an inner pedagogy, an architecture producing new ways of being in the world. Humbler, more effective, less performative. Everything we have seen is part of the same gesture, to make conscious what was once automatic. This journey, from invisible pain to the wisdom of return, is not the privilege of a few, but the demand of a soul that chooses maturity. Jung reminds us that individuation is not comfort, it is ethical courage. Rumi reminds us that transformation passes through a wound that opens to light. Recognizing conscious solitude as a passage, not a verdict, is a mature attitude. Understanding the illusion of performance as defense reveals where integration is needed. Silence ceases to be escape when it becomes a source of decision. The collective shadow ceases to be punishment when we accept it as material to serve with clarity. And return, the act of reappearing in the world, is the proof that retreat had a purpose. To serve without acting, to offer without evangelizing, to exist without losing oneself. The final question I leave as a bridge for your practical work. What small fidelity today are you willing to honor, even if it costs you social approval? That fidelity is the compass that will guide your next choices. It is not about heroism, it is about coherence. And what if the pain you live is, in fact, an invitation? If inner noise is the compass and silence the workshop where answers are shaped, take this as challenge and commitment, not as sentence. Symbolic practice, contemplative version, without cliches. Set aside 5 minutes, without dramatic preparations, simply with a firm seat and your breath as guide. Take 3 deep breaths and, with each inhale, feel that you welcome what has been suppressed. With each exhale, allow the need to perform to lose strength. Observe without judgment the inner noise, thoughts, sensations, images. Name them mentally without holding on: fear, guilt, doubt, longing, and let each name be like a leaf falling from a tree, acknowledged and released. At the end, make a brief note, 2 lines: what was the most insistent content? What small gesture can you take in the next 24 hours to honor what your conscience asks? This record is the practical map that links silence and action. If this content touched something real in you, an unease, a confirmation, a learning, I invite you to stay on this path with gentleness and consistency. Subscribe to the channel to continue receiving reflections that treat spirituality, personal development, and spiritual awakening with seriousness and integrity. Leave in the comments which point of this journey resonated most. Your words may be the mirror someone needed. And if you wish to go deeper, I recommend watching the suggested video. It expands on the practice of silence as a laboratory. Peace and light.